Despite the rallying around non conventional energy, crude oil still remains a pivotal part of the global energy sector. War, maybe high costs of production and research of non conventional energy, whatever the reason, crude oil is here to stay, at least for a long time to come. To discuss and give us an overview of the energy sector, global energy sector, as well as to discuss the challenges faced by conventional and non conventional energy sectors, I'm joined now by Pranshu Praleya, Senior Energy Analyst from MBB Firms.
So when you talk of energy mostly, the two immediate things that come to mind with the word conventional is oil and gas basically. They are the ones that have been powering almost all the sectors, be it automotive or electricity, that ultimately becomes a secondary source of energy there. So that's what it has been so far, and oil and gas particularly has been the dominant source of energy so far, and still is, if you look at the global perspective.
So, how much percentage is still conventional energy globally?
Globally, yeah, it's close to 60-70% for sure. Even in advanced economies like US alone, you see that electricity, majority of that comes from fossil fuels. Around 60-70% every year comes from fossil fuels actually. So if we take that to the global scale, it would definitely be more.
So why are conventional energy prices rising? Is it just the Ukraine war, or is it a supply constraint? What is it? Is it a demand-supply gap?
Yeah, so ultimately it's always a demand-supply gap that happens. And also a bit of artificial methods by which they control the prices. So if you look at it closely, there is a cartel called OPEC.
Right.
They actually are a conglomerate of major oil and gas producing countries, and they all decide together of how much they're going to produce each year, and that is what reflects upon the prices ultimately. So on most occasions, especially after 2013 to be particular, like OPEC cartel became more active in controlling the prices. They artificially cut down the production and the prices drop.
That's always been there. However, we also see a hue and cry against conventional energy sources. How much of a difference is that? How much of a difference is that making on the hardcore working of big corporations, oil corporations? Are they cognizant of this hue and cry, or are they not taking this into consideration?
No, they are actually. In fact, every oil and gas company today is making some effort to switch to renewables. Some are also successful in that, and many others are just doing it for the sake of doing it right now. But all of them actually have it in their agenda and the strategy, and all of them are trying to develop this resource within them, either organically or inorganically through mergers and acquisitions.
The one thing that comes to my mind is, do you see in the near future some kind of a meltdown of some companies at least that are not able to be swift enough to change, or
Yes.
to, because there's a lot of carbon taxation and a lot of
Exactly.
social responsibility and a lot of public response that matters as well. Do you think there's going to be a meltdown?
Yes, in fact it has already started, I would say. If you look to the North American market in particular, where there is a lot of privatization, as opposed to the other parts of the world where mostly government does this operation, you would see that a lot of consolidations happen. Smaller companies being acquired by the larger ones.
Oh, I see. That's
Yeah.
happening already.
Yeah, that's been happening already, even in Canada alone. Like today, let's speaking objectively, we say that the biggest company is Imperial Oil, which in fact is actually a potential acquiring company of ExxonMobil. So it had started like many years ago, just because the smaller companies were not really profitable, and it becomes more pronounced, especially as the prices drop.
Also, there's a lot of pressure on governments, especially we are seeing liberal governments, Democrat
Yes.
government in the US, and there's been a lot of setback to these industries, Suncore, the pipelines. How have they coped with it? How has it reflected in shareholdings, the price on the index, the market, stock market price? What do you see happening inside these companies because of all these delays and ramblings over there should be no pipelines?
Yeah, it is particularly more pronounced in Canada today, and now is becoming also quite effective with the new government in the US. So basically, you see that it affects the project economics ultimately. Today in Canada we have a nationwide carbon tax, which is currently absent in the US, where they are considering on having it implemented in some years from now. So all of those actually affect the project economics. So that is something that has led to the smaller companies going bankrupt either, or like going in loss completely, you would see that ones that are publicly listed have registered a significant drop in the share prices and the market valuation as well.
So this carbon tax that you were talking about is eventually paid for by the consumer. Do the oil companies have to pay anything in terms of the, there was this talk about how much pollution they are leading to, and that their footprint would be.
Yeah, I would say it actually ultimately affects the profit margins, given that the oil prices are anyway governed by the competition today. It's not regulated like electricity. So let's say an oil producer in Canada will be subject to selling their commodity at the WCS price, which is the local benchmark in this country. And anyway, WCS price has to ultimately compete with the WTI price in the US and the Brent price globally. So if you look at the other two economies that I just mentioned, there isn't any implementation of carbon tax yet.
So it's negatively impacting Canadian companies.
Yes.
And are they moving out? Any government that's not, any country that's not sustainable for corporate development or growth, they may be looking at other countries where taxation.
You can see that, yeah, exactly. A lot of international companies that were operating in Canada, they were forced to divest of their assets and move elsewhere.
Could you give us an example?
Shell, Total, these two are very big examples of this trend, I would say. And even ExxonMobil has undergone a lot of divestiture in Canada alone.
Where do they go eventually? They just divest and they just close operations? Or?
Yeah, they basically close off the operations because it's not as profitable, and they either move into renewables, wherever the internal rate of return is more profitable, or they are still actively exploring in other regions where there are no restrictions as of now, particularly Africa. If you look, like Total has registered the biggest discovery of all time in the last year in Angola alone. And similar examples could be found in Latin America, particularly Brazil. The exploration is still happening at a rampant scale.
So I'm not trying to be negative here, but or politicizing it, but because of this liberal atmosphere of carbon taxation, Canadian companies have been left behind, or are they seeking oil sources outside? The US, of course, the US companies are, but what's happening to the Canadian? Because we have a lot of oil too.
Yeah,
Newfoundland, Alberta.
No, Canada in fact is the largest. Like in terms of the oil reserves alone, Canada ranks fourth in the world.
Right.
And it accounts to more than 5% of the global production still.
So why are we not there? Like, why don't we have an ExxonMobil or a Total, however way you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Why?
Ultimately, the primary reason actually you could say is a bit of unluck with Canada because of the geological setup that exists here. Although Canada has got a very high amount of reserves, it's still not as commercially extractable as you tend to get in the US or the Middle East or even the Caspian Sea region.
So it's cost of production because of the technological difficulty.
Exactly.
But in the US, I remember those old oil wells.
Yes.
They revisited them. They improved technology and they became the old capped oil wells. They went back and they were able to extract. So why doesn't the government have anything like that? A technological innovative plan?
Yes, ultimately the prices that determine everything. So if you look into the US, they were majorly net importer up to 2012 or 2016 to be more precise, 2015, 2016 around that time. And what really made the difference was in fact the oil prices. So right after the Iraq war in 2008, the oil prices just went above. It began to soar above 115 and was pretty much around 120 range for the longest period of time. And that really fueled all of these oil and gas companies to fund their R&D to make the commercially unextractable reserves into economically feasible. So that is what made the difference in both USA and Canada. So Canada has got oil sands, actually in the most amounts, and quite a bit of oil shale as well. So all of that, if you look at it, is not really competitive in terms of the other resources that we have from the Middle East.
So what do you see happening? These resources will just lie in the womb of the Canadian womb, and they'll just be there, and we will never be able to extract because times are moving ahead.
Exactly. You could say that. I just happened to look at it a couple of days ago. In the last 5 years, there has only been one new project of exploration and development in Canada that has been approved by the government.
Which is where? Which is in?
It's in Alberta. Alberta provides about 95% of the oil and gas, and the remaining states barely make up 2 or 3%.
So you don't see this east-west oil pipeline also coming through There was this talk by Mr.
Yeah.
Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, who was very keen on this pipeline. Do you see that ever happening, his dream ever being fulfilled?
It's quite unlikely. Like if the demand actually drops as we are moving towards in that direction, then it's quite unlikely that it will happen in the future if it hasn't happened so far.
Let's come
The
down.
Canadian refineries are already facing the brunt of it.
But are the Texas refineries modernizing to receive Canadian oil, or have they stopped?
So they were already designed to do that. Like if you look into the history, they were already receiving crude oil from Venezuela, which is ultimately heavy oil.
Yes.
And Canadian oil sands have got physical characteristics quite akin to that very kind of oil.
Right.
So when the sanctions were imposed in Venezuela, the US refineries immediately switched to the Canadian oil producers ultimately. And you would see there was an absence of domestic pipeline connecting Alberta with the other states that are far away from it and have got refineries like Newfoundland, New Brunswick.
Yeah.
All of them actually are importing oil in fact from the US just because there's no pipeline to connect the oil fields in Alberta
Yeah.
to those regions.
As far as non-conventional energy goes, do you see any movement in Canada per se towards development of, because it's huge as far as wind
Yeah.
and as far as not solar so much?
Exactly. So now here we are moving to a secondary source. So when it comes to electricity alone, which is a secondary source of electricity that in fact fuels most of our operations today, so that even historically was pretty renewable in Canada. They were depending on hydro resources for most purposes and nuclear, which does not really emit as much as the fossil fuel counterparts do. So Canada was anyway pretty much equipped to do this thing. So they were pretty good in it. And when it comes to the other sources where electricity has not reached, there is a very dedicated effort to make electricity penetrate those regions. I'm talking about electrification of transportation, more EVs and more electric buses coming on the roads. Then we are talking about electrification of heating. Like all the gas heaters that we have today are to be electrified in the future. So once we attain that goal, we would actually be able to position ourselves in Canada at least as the renewable leader of the world.
So do you see any new companies forming in in renewable energy? Do you see, or are the old companies gearing up to what's happening there?
So if you look actually in the field of renewables, in Canada it's pretty much a nationalized market. Like all the 10 provinces in Canada, and around 80% of them have their own crown-owned national companies that generate electricity. And privatization is very little. So in those setups, I do not really see a lot of companies coming up. However, many of the private utilities in the US are actually penetrating the Canadian market. Either through the building up the transmission distribution lines, or like inorganically contributing to the independent power producers that exist.
The way I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, is the Middle East is again emerging as a huge potential for non-conventional energy, huge potential in Saudi Arabia, in UAE for solar energy, etc. And unlike crude oil, it's very difficult to transport these kind of the new kind of energy from one country to the other. Difficult to build these grids that are so expensive, and such long distance grid transmission is kind of impossible, at least in the current period that we're living in. And a complete ban or a movement away from crude oil is kind of scary, because there may come a time when countries like Canada or the US may not be able to produce or may not be able to fructify non-conventional energy projects into actual transmission of energy, commercial energy. And we may end up with some very dangerous scenarios for humankind. For instance, very high costs of non-conventional energy, as also it could be a scarcity of demand supply gaps, etc. So it may not be completely sane or wise to completely ban crude oil production.
Yeah. So the thing is that electricity as a commodity is not as fungible as we have it in terms of oil and gas. They cannot really be traded overseas.
Right.
They are pretty generated locally and consumed even there, within the particular region. At most, there could be intra-terrestrial transportation with the border nations, but that's it. That's pretty much we are talking about. So I would not really see a lot of development of in Saudi Arabia or UAE, the way they are going about in the development of their smart cities, to impact the economies here in North America, particularly Canada and the US. I would not really say that that particular development is anyway going to affect us.
But my point was that they will go ahead because they have the natural resources like sun. Solar is easier to make than ocean energy. And we have wind and ocean. We could have a wind bridge between Montana and Canada, but that's a very, very expensive thing. What I'm seeing is that because we don't, because there'll be hue and cry about conventional energy, the pricing of non-conventional energy, because we cannot import it, may just be too high for us to afford in Canada or in the US.
Yeah.
US still has its sunny patches like California. There's a lot of sun, but
it's actually
Canada
it's actually a pretty good question there. Like it depends, like who's gifted how much in terms of reception of the solar power that we have across the different countries. Where a particular country can come up is the development of storage technology, because no matter how clean or efficient the sun is, it ultimately is available only for a certain number of hours in a day. The moment the sun sets, that's when actually we need the electricity the most. So that's how the consumption, the demand-supply pattern has been so far. So unless we have a very robust technology of energy storage that's able to discharge electricity over a long duration of time, I would not really say that a country would become proficient by just building up solar alone.
I got you. But then even the distribution of non-conventional energy, they're trying to make it, make the conventional energy grid work, for electricity. But I wonder if they'll have to one fine day wake up to a completely new grid for non-conventional energy distribution, or will we be able to use the current grids, the distribution network? That's huge, colossal investments there.
Yeah, that's actually a challenge everywhere in the world, because even in the US, especially after the Inflation Reduction Act,
right,
a lot of new plants are coming up. Even the companies today are proposing much more of capacity to come up online by 2027, 2030, just to reap the benefits of the income tax subsidies. The problem exists in connecting them to the grid, because anyway, the transmission and distribution of electricity has largely been a regulated sector, and the costs incurred there are immediately transferred to the end consumers.
No, but it's subsidized as well, if I'm not mistaken, in countries like Canada, where it's government controlled mostly. Or am I wrong there?
No, they don't subsidize it particularly, at least in North America. What they do is that they regulate it. So they set up a cost of rate service. It's a cost plus structure.
Right.
You make certain investments, and you're entitled to earn a particular return on those investments. So those returns actually come up directly from the regulator. So every province actually is a regulatory body. So that's how it has been actually in the USA and Canada, because they together form the same system, and they are governed largely by non-profit organizations that are regional transmission organizations, or they also call it independent system operators, RTOs and ISOs. So they basically govern all of it. Yeah. So it's not really subsidized by the government, but especially in this economy, it's subsidized in other parts of the world. That's true, but the returns are regulated by the government or the regulatory body.
I'm also very curious to know from you. Non-conventional energy we say is very, very non-pollutant. But when I study ocean energy, the way they have to go deep down into the ocean, it's very polluting too. You're disturbing a lot of marine life. Yes. You're disturbing bird life. What do you have to say to critics of conventional energy who feel, that that's the only way to go, non-conventional way?
Yeah, the challenges exist. You will see a lot of environmental bodies and organizations that form a lobby. Mm-hmm. They don't really let the new plants come up. But I do not really see a lot of harm happening to the plants that already exist there. It's like a one-time challenge that you face. So in order to combat it, there are local governments. What they do is that they implement setback laws on the erection of new wind farms, on the installation of new dams, and things like that. So those are the initial challenge that you have to face. But once you have identified a site and have got a regulatory permit, I think you have pretty much done with that.
Any predictions on the end year for conventional energy, the conventional oil and gas as we see it today? Do you have any date in mind when it will be completely redundant?
Well, there is an official date of 2050 when all the advanced economies are saying they're going to become net zero.
And they'll be complete, and they say they'll be able to generate non-conventional energy by then,
Yeah,
2050?
that's what they are saying each year when they sit together and
Yeah.
under COP meetings. They say that that's what they are planning to do. They're
Do
planning
you
to
see that happening as a consultant of energy? Do you
No,
see
actually they are behind.
they're behind
Yeah,
by
every
how
year, like pretty much, I would say. Like,
a decade or so?
let me say, for example, EI is the official body in the US. They had come up with a forecast, and EI is a body that's
Yes.
also the mouthpiece actually of the government of the US. So when they came up with the forecast, even the most recent forecast that released this month itself, the prediction of the emissions is not at all zero by 2035, as the government is targeting. It's still within 5 megatons per metric tons per year. As far as I remember, I'm not able to recollect the exact data, but I just want to create a sense that they are far behind currently.
So which
If we
is
go by the stated policies, they are pretty much behind.
which country is foremost right now in taking the lead in non-conventional energy?
In fact, all the European countries are doing pretty well in
European
here,
countries.
especially the Western European countries.
And what is the source of non-conventional energy that is being most exploited right now? Is it
Like they were spearheading the wind movement.
wind?
When it started, you would see that a lot of offshore wind developments had started to happen in Europe many years ago. And the USA just came up with it in 2022, I would say, with the first auction that happened. So that is something that they pioneered pretty early on. And solar is something that they were capitalizing on from, I think, many years ago, prior to when the US actually had even started looking in that direction.
Do you know anything about the CIS pipelines? I mean, Russia and China. China has been a major consumer of energy because of its population, and so is India. Do you know what's happening to the CIS country pipeline? Is it?
There are two sets of things. One set of pipelines exists that connects Russia with the European markets.
Right.
Nord Stream 1 and 2 is particularly the names of that. You would see the one has already been constructed, or rather damaged in the war
Yeah,
currently.
the war, yeah. Because Ukraine was was the transit point, and that's where the whole fight was. How much money do they get for transiting Russian oil to Europe? That was a major problem.
Exactly, and the pipeline phase 2 was supposed to be constructed, but I don't really see that happening, given the stance of all of those nations have changed. They are looking to diversify away from the Russian gas as of now. But again, there will be consequences if the pipeline is not constructed even in the future. Currently you see the prices of electricity in the European regions are at least twice or thrice than that of the US.
Right.
And let's say any climatic event happens, something that's not expected, a black swan appears in the US, then they are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add to the conversation? Any major issues that you see in the sector?
I believe it largely touched on all of those. The war definitely actually it's adding on to the inflation, and especially energy inflation, which has almost touched 40% if you look in the last 2 years alone.
So Europe must be impacted a lot because Ukraine was the transition territory through which the oil was passing.
Yes, they were impacted by the lack of supply from gas, but they also benefited from the recessionist situation in China. So many of the gas shipments that were bound to China were diverted to Europe.
From Russia?
Yes. So that is what saved them. No, not from Russia. I mean to say that the oil shipments from other parts of the world, like Australia and US, what were actually bound to China, were in fact diverted to Europe. This helped them replenish their inventory during the winters of 2022. And that is something that saved the disaster from happening.
Interesting.
Otherwise, the oil prices could have soared at any length. You saw what happened in Uri in Texas.
Right, right.
Yeah, the gas prices just went no holds barred there. So something similar could have happened in Europe, but this is something that saved them, and along with the nature's gift of milder winters.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Done.